We have a great speaker tonight. Will McLean Greeley grew up in West Michigan with a passion for American history, politics, and birds. He earned a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Michigan and then a master's degree from Michigan in archives administration. After retiring from a 35-year career in government and corporate market research, he embarked upon a 3-year research and a writing journey to learn about his great-great-uncle George McLean and his legacy. A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington is his first book. The author will provide a 30-minute overview of his new biography of Senator George P. McLean, sponsor of the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty. This is a full-scale biography of the person most responsible for ending the needless wholesale killing of birds at a critical point in time. The author will trace McLean's rise from obscurity as a Connecticut farm boy to national prominence. McLean came to know 7 U.S. presidents and spent 18 years in the U.S. Senate. Greeley's book has been endorsed by 10 ornithologists and historians, including David Allen Sibley, Birding Authority, and Dr. Donald Ritchie, historian emeritus for the U.S. Senate. A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington was published by the Rochester Institute of Technology Press in March 2023. We'll have a short membership meeting after the presentation, and everyone say a prayer for Rob Swindell. He's recovering from COVID, and he's had a really rough year. So, Will Greeley.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I add my prayers to Rob. I talked to him over the phone several times, and just when we think COVID is in the rearview mirror, or it's another reminder that it's still with us, and so yes, I'm going to be praying for Rob. Wish we could have met tonight. Well, it's never easy to lead change, and it takes special people to lead change. I've got a quote about change. Change hurts. It makes people uncomfortable, insecure, angry, and confused. People want things to be the same as they always were because that's what makes life easy and comfortable. I'm going to talk to you tonight about a time of change and a person who I believe was most responsible for creating a very needed change. And that was, of course, passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. One of my key themes tonight is that George P. McLean, picture of him here, it's the cover of my book, played an indispensable role in leading passage of America's first and most important legislation to protect wildlife, and of course in this case birds, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. That's my key theme for tonight. It's just a great pleasure to be here. You know, you're my first in-person presentation for my book. I've done several Zoom presentations, and I much prefer this setting to be with people and not just looking at my computer screen and hoping that I can connect with those who are interested in this topic. I began this book in 2018, and that was on the 100th anniversary of the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is still in effect today. I assume most of you know that. There were a number of news articles about the MBTA in 2018. Some called this legislation America's most important legislation protecting wildlife. Others called out George P. McLean's leadership role in its passage. One conservationist said that the MBTA has saved millions, if not billions, of birds from needless killing, and quite possibly has prevented the extinction of many bird species. But for me, this news coverage triggered nagging questions and curiosity I've had about this man my whole life. My middle name is McLean. He's my great-great-uncle. And I've always wanted to know more about him, to learn his life story and to put the MBTA into a broader context and see how it fit into his life story. He was in the U.S. Senate for 18 years, and I knew this man must have led an interesting life, but he had been pretty much forgotten in our family history, and so I embarked on virtually a 4-year research and writing journey to learn more about him. You know, sometimes I call this book my third child. We have 2 sons. The difference is it took 9 months for that child to be born. It took 4 years for this book to come to fruition. But before I jump into my remarks and develop those themes that I mentioned, the MBTA being important conservation and George P. McLean playing this indispensable role in it, it's just great to be in the company of people who love birds. Because I too love birds. I always have. It's said that 1 out of 4 people are bird watchers. I think that number is understated. I'll give you an example. My wife is not somebody who would call herself a bird watcher, but when we're out hiking, something we both love to do, we were just in Hocking Hills the last couple of days, and we see this bird, scarlet tanager. She's not a bird watcher, but her soul is thrilled to see that bird. We saw it last summer at a place in Upper Michigan called Hartwick Pines. In the sun, caught that beautiful scarlet color. Now, one of the compensations about getting older is we get to cross items off our bucket list. And one of mine was to bird in Costa Rica. And we saw this. Now, I didn't take this picture, but these are, of course, toucans. And what a thrill that was. And this bird I have not seen, but this is kind of my audience participation part. I wonder how many, do you know what this is? Painted bunting. To get to know you a little bit better, how many have actually seen one of these? Oh, this is a great group, because that's on my list of birds that have eluded me for many, many years, and sometimes I've given up hope that I'll ever see one. But what a beautiful bird that is. This other bird that my wife has seen with me in Tucson, Arizona, is an elf owl, one of the smallest owls. To give you a sense of its size, Mary, my wife, I think would have taken this home as a pet if she could, but I told her that would be a violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Can't take that home as a pet. But one of the things about this picture that stands out to me is the smile on this person's face. To simply state it, birds make us happy, don't they? And there's many reasons for that. They get us out into nature. The endless variety, the shapes, the sizes, the colors, the songs. How many other creatures in wildlife sing such beautiful songs? And their behavior is so endlessly fascinating. Migration, nesting habits, feeding habits. And so, at its root, birds make us happy, and we, by our nature, want to protect those things that make us happy, those things we care about, those things that we love. And I want you to imagine a time, I'm going to roll back the clock to around 1900, when birds were not protected. And there was this cycle of killing of birds that was going on for decades with no end in sight. And there were really 4 causes to this killing of birds. Birds have always been hunted as a protein source since the beginning of time. And as our country grew after the Civil War from 31 million people in 1860 to 72 million by 1900, there were more mouths to feed. And people were consuming more birds. But then added to that was the fads and fashions of the late 1800s. The putting of birds' feathers on hats. And it wasn't just women that overhunted birds. Senator McLean, on a speech in the Senate, decried a man's vest that was made out of hummingbird hides. Some 1,000 hides to make this beautiful vest that sold for $10,000 in 1912. You can imagine what that would be today. So added to hunting birds for food, hunting birds for fashion, there were more mouths to feed, more heads to put hats on. But the critical change came around 1890, and that was the advent of the shotgun, the automatic pump shotgun, where individual hunters now became killing machines. And the hunting of birds went from hundreds of thousands of birds per year to millions, to tens of millions, and growing ever higher. And by the end of the century, in the 1800s, the wanton killing of birds just went on and on and on, higher and higher, and there was no end in sight because each state was free to set its own hunting regulations and laws, and these laws, as weak as they were rarely enforced. So this is a situation that George P. McLean inherited when he arrived in the U.S. Senate in 1911. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is some life experiences that George P. McLean had that prepared and equipped him to lead passage of this very, very significant legislation. The MBTA was passed in 1918. It was a major legislative achievement, but most people don't know much about it. I say there's two camps about the MBTA. It's either a footnote or it's a full-time job. There are many people who it's their life's work to interpret these complex laws and regulations and the endless policy implications to enforce the MBTA. But for most of us, it's a footnote in history. And what I want to do tonight is to deepen your appreciation for the MBTA by putting a personal face on its passage and to share with you a little bit about the significant struggle that went on to pass this legislation. So the three key life experiences I'm going to talk about that George P. McLean had, because this is really a biography of a man whose key achievement was passing the MBTA. The first key experience he had was his rise from obscurity as a Connecticut farm boy to national prominence. He grew up on a subsistence farm in rural Connecticut, and he went to high school wearing clothing made by his mother, and he was bullied by the rich townies from Hartford Public High School in Connecticut for what he wore. But over time, he became more respected by his peers because they considered him the brainiest member of their class. And when he graduated from high school, he said he had two dreams. First, he wanted to become publisher of the largest newspaper in Connecticut. And secondly, he wanted to become president of the United States. I have a picture of him here and when he graduated from high school. And when he his first job was as a newspaper reporter, and it was there that he met many influential politicians covering them for his newspaper, and they saw in McLean a very able, ambitious, personable young man, and they encouraged him to study the law. And so he became a lawyer, and then they said they encouraged him to run for his first political office. So at the age of 25, he was elected to the Connecticut State Legislature. And there we see his first evidence that he was a political reformer. He took on the very corrupt practice in Connecticut at that time of how pardons were granted to the imprisoned. It was done by the legislature, and they would have a time when people could ask for a pardon, and it was like a circus-like atmosphere. People would come from around and watch these pardons being granted, and quite often there was bribery and influence trading. And so he decided that a board of pardons, using the governor, taking it out of the hands of the legislature, would be the way to go. And so that was his first key political achievement, was this Connecticut Board of Pardons. And he left the legislature in his 30s now. He held a variety of positions in government. He was U.S. Attorney for Connecticut, appointed by then Benjamin Harrison. He knew 4 presidents from Ohio, so for the Ohio connection, that was his first Ohioan that he worked with. But these were all stepping stones to his major position as a young man, and that was to run for governor. And he ran for governor of Connecticut and was elected in the year 1900. And that is his being a political up-and-comer on his way to the White House, so he hoped. And as a reform-minded governor, he had a very ambitious reform agenda for the state of Connecticut. And I'll just briefly recap it. But this was in preparing him, I think, for his eventual great achievement of the MBTA, was this experience of trying to lead reform at the state level. He advocated women's suffrage for local and municipal elections only. This was 1900, and I think he was kind of planting a seed that maybe this was something that the state should endorse. Also, free textbooks for public school students. And then he proposed a tax on moneyed corporations, which was sort of like his peer Theodore Roosevelt at that time. And also some other reforms aimed at empowering the cities and giving them greater representation in the state legislature. But the most important thing I want to talk about his time as governor was that his reforms were very unsuccessful. He faced opposition primarily from people who had supported him. Now, McLean was a Republican, but the leaders of the Republican Party didn't like all of these reforms. But he was a young reformer in the mold of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson at that time. And so this experience as a reform-minded governor ended rather badly after his end of his term. He was very discouraged. He was burned out from trying to lead all of this reform, and all of this sent him into a paralyzing depression. And this is the third life experience that I want to share with you about George P. McLean that I think ultimately prepared and equipped him to pass the MBTA, was an experience of defeat and exile into the political wilderness by his many opponents. So from about 1902 to 1910, before he went into the U.S. Senate, he was largely out of the public eye, exiled into the political wilderness by his many opponents. But it was during this time that he regrouped and he got a new sense of himself. And a number of things happened in his personal life during this time of exile. For instance, in 1906, McLean was already a wealthy man from his law practice. He inherited $3 million in 1906 from his father's sister, his Aunt Sarah, who was a wealthy widow from New York City. Now, $3 million in 1906 equates to about $80 million today. In 1907, McLean married for the first time. He had put his personal life largely on hold, but he married in 1907 to Juliet Goodrich, and she was a longtime companion, a friend of his from his hometown of Simsbury. And the two loved to travel together. McLean was buying up hundreds of acres of land around his boyhood farm. And now he's in his early 50s. He's a very wealthy man, largest private landholder in Connecticut, with his options virtually unlimited for the future. You can imagine what you could do. Travel the world, build several homes wherever you wanted. But instead, he found a way back into politics and ran for the U.S. Senate in 1911 and was elected there to his first of 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. So now we get to the heart of my book, and that is what he did as a U.S. Senator elected in 1911. He's now in his 50s. Well, this was a 7-year struggle to pass the MBTA. McLean and others faced staunch opposition from hunting interests, business interests, and states' rights advocates. Now, the hunting interests were comprised of those who hunted birds for food. An example of that was the passenger pigeon. And I know that Ohio has a very strong tie to the fate of the passenger pigeon. So does Michigan, my home state. They were once the most abundant bird in North America, some 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons. It is said that when a flock of passenger pigeons flew over Columbus, Ohio, it was 95 miles long, and it darkened the sky for virtually a whole day. 3 to 5 billion. They were hunted into extinction because they were prized for their food. It was a very popular food item. But then there were those who hunted birds for their feathers, as I said, for women's hats primarily. But the most formidable opposition to the MBTA came from the states' rights advocates. By the way, there were 83,000 people employed in making hats in 1911. So it was a very big industry, and they were a very powerful lobbying group. But the states' rights advocates were the most formidable opposition to the MBTA, and they argued that the federal government had no role in areas that were reserved for the state governments, and that they could not impose national standards on the states. The states were free to set their own hunting laws. So this was the major struggle for McLean and others to overcome the states' rights advocates. And I show in my book how they did that. So I want to recap these 3 life experiences of George P. McLean that led him to prepared and equipped him to pass the MBTA, and talk about how I think they add reader interest for you. His rise from obscurity. I think there's something inherently interesting about observing how does somebody rise from absolute anonymity to ultimate national notoriety. How does that happen? And I think in his case, this is really an example of the American dream writ large. It's a rags to riches story. And I think there's something inherently interesting about seeing how someone does that. The second life experience was his time trying to lead reform as a young governor. McLean lived during a time of massive change. You know, this is the industrialization of America, going from rural to urban society. And this is a fascinating time. It was really the best of times. It was a time of great wealth creation, time of great job growth, immigration, millions of people coming into the country every year. But it was also the worst of times in terms of many of the social and economic and political and environmental problems that came from all of this unrestrained growth that went on after the Civil War. The third life experience that McLean had was this defeat and exile. After being an unsuccessful governor, he went into this extended period of a depression. And so in many ways, this is an inspiring story of someone overcoming adversity, learning from his mistakes and not quitting, coming back into the U.S. Senate. He could have lived a life of leisure after he left the Senate with the wealth that he had. And so, in other words, who doesn't like a comeback story? And that really is part of my narrative. So I want to talk a little bit about McLean's legacy, coming to the close of my remarks. As I said, the MBTA has saved millions, if not billions of birds and prevented the extinction of many bird species. And it's really our bedrock of legislation, still in effect today. So that is, in and of itself, a significant legacy. But there's a couple of other dimensions to this achievement I want to highlight tonight. This was foundational law. It was precedent setting. It really ended that era of states' rights, allowing every state to pursue its own way. And it expanded the role of the federal government to intervene in other areas relating to conservation and the environment. There was the Bald Eagle Act of the 1940s that put protections for the bald eagle federally. Then there was the Endangered Species Act of the 1970s, the Animal Welfare Act. In some ways, the Environmental Protection Act itself is this concept of the federal government imposing national standards on the states and enforcing them. And before the MBTA, this was just not done. And it paved the way for that with a challenge in the U.S. Supreme Court to enable this to happen. Secondly, another aspect to this achievement I want to highlight is that its global scope. So this was a U.S. law, but it had global implications. And we all know that birds migrate, right? They're not respecters of national borders. And at the heart of the MBTA, I think the real genius of this act, is that it's a series of treaties between and among nations that assure the preservation of birds wherever they are in their migratory cycle. The original legislation only pertained to protecting birds in the U.S., but over time, the 7-year period where this legislation was developed and debated, it ended up as a global treaty. And that's why I think it has endured for 100 years, and hopefully will for another 100, is the fact that it's a global treaty. So I have a closing question for you. I want to ask a question about George P. McLean that was once asked about another George. And the question is, what would the world have been like if George P. McLean had never been born? Do you know who that question was asked, the other George I'm talking about? George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life. Do you know that movie? Well, if you haven't seen it, go out and get it. But what would the world have been like if George P. McLean had never been born? Well, I think eventually there would have been some bird protection passed. But when and to what extent? So let me just hit some highlights of what was unique and why George P. McLean was this indispensable figure that I mentioned about bird protection. His first speech, his maiden speech in the U.S. Senate in 1911, was on the topic of migratory bird protection. So a good leader puts forth urgency and a vision for change and says this is an issue that we need to change, we need to focus on. Another sign of a good leader is that they overcome obstacles when opposition comes up. And you'll see in my book that the 7-year struggle that McLean had was in many ways responding to the opposition that occurred from these hunting groups, the business groups, and the states' rights advocates. And he never gave up. This perseverance that I think he developed from his unsuccessful time as governor really came into play in how he overcame obstacles and was flexible and adapted to these different challenges. Another sign of a good leader of change is that they build coalitions. Change starts small with just a couple of people, but you need to broaden it out and get support from other people and other groups. And McLean did that by involving Audubon societies, other conservation groups, gun manufacturers, these pump shotguns I mentioned earlier. He was able to get them to support this legislation because they had a vested interest as well in keeping bird populations higher. But he formed this wide coalition of groups, including Henry Ford, the automaker, to bring in to support this legislation. And very importantly, this was signed in July of 1918. And that was a very difficult year for the United States. We were at war in Europe. There was a global flu pandemic, and this legislation was signed on July 3rd, 1918 by President Woodrow Wilson, who many of you might know was a Democrat, McLean a Republican, and at the signing ceremony, Woodrow Wilson handed the pen to George P. McLean, which today would be like President Biden handing the pen to, say, Marco Rubio, a Republican senator from Florida. So that was the bipartisan nature of this accomplishment. And it's something that I think we could learn much from today, to see how people come together to solve important problems. But it takes leaders like George P. McLean and others to do that. I believe that the window was closing on reform in 1918. For those of you who like American history, there was this period called the Progressive Era, which was Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and others. And some people date it from around 1900 to 1920. So the window was closing on this era of reform. And had this not been passed in July 1918, it very well could, bird legislation could have been put on the back burner during the Roaring '20s, this time of great prosperity and limited federal government activity. And then after the 1920s, we had the Great Depression. And there could have been another reason to put bird protection on the back burner because we were in an economic crisis. So in closing, I believe that the world is a better place, that George P. McLean didn't quit after that very turbulent time as a young governor of Connecticut, but instead he, along with many others in the U.S. Senate, helped stop the killing of some of God's most beautiful creations and put in place lasting legal protections for birds that we'll enjoy and benefit from today. Thank you. Now, I have a 3-minute video that I'd like to share with you, George P. McLean. I also have some books here, should you like one, and these cards here in case you would like to just take some information. The book is available through my publisher, RIT Press. They would probably like you to buy it from them directly, but it is also available on Amazon. But this is the video tribute to George P. McLean. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. as I said, it's a real pleasure to be here with other bird lovers, and we have time for a few questions if you have any. Larry?
I have a comment. Too bad he wasn't elected in 1900 instead of 1911. It might still be passenger pigeons. You know?
Yeah. The fate of the passenger pigeon is really, truly a tragic situation. But I think what's interesting is that was not the only bird that was on the verge of extinction. The snowy egret, the wood duck, the flamingo, the spoonbill. There were so many that were teetering on extinction. Of course, there were others: the heath hen, the great auk, the Carolina parakeet. The only endemic parrot in the United States went into extinction, and I think we don't appreciate how this was a critical point in time, and that's why when I call him the indispensable person. Had it waited longer, many of these other birds may have vanished because they were so in demand. One of the things I didn't mention was that the MBTA stopped what was called the spring hunting season. It was very popular to hunt ducks, and not just ducks, but you're talking about birds nesting were hunted. And so the MBTA, one of the reasons why you only have hunting in the fall is that it prohibited hunting in the spring, which is, of course, during the time that birds are nesting. And so that's how out of control it was, because states wanted to have that right to have a spring hunting season. And that was one of the reasons they resisted the change for so long. Yes?
What was the source of his passion for, this is a long process he got into.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming he got a tremendous amount of pushback. So,
yes.
What was the source of his passion for?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, he grew up in an idyllic country setting in outside of Hartford, Connecticut, a place called Simsbury, and he grew up at a time when nature was just teeming, and he was actually a hunter in his early years, but he renounced hunting as he saw the dwindling in population. He was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, and I would say that the two had in common this idea that many hunters often become the best conservationists, but McLean, unlike Roosevelt, renounced hunting eventually because he was so committed to it. So I think he was sensitized as a young person to nature. He set aside over 4,000 acres of land that is now in existence called the McLean Game Refuge in Connecticut. And he said in his will that he wanted this place to remain undeveloped and be a place, a refuge for people to commune with the things of God, the things of nature that were so important to him. And that place still exists today. It's 4,000 acres, miles of trails. I think there was a spiritual component to it as well. He saw nature as a God-given resource that we were here to protect. He talked about that in many ways. So I think if you think about Theodore Roosevelt, the two were very friendly. If you like presidential history, I think you'll find my book interesting. I do document his relationship with the 7 presidents that he knew, 4 of them that he knew very well while he was in the Senate. And Roosevelt was one of his friends and associates.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
What part of Connecticut is that reserve in?
Simsbury, Connecticut, it was his hometown. It's about 20 miles from Hartford. So Hartford is sort of in the eastern part of Connecticut, if you know that well. Do you?
I'm from New York State, right near there.
Yeah. Well, part of my research was to go to Connecticut, and I did it in February of 2020. And I remember getting on a plane to go to Hartford and hearing about some kind of virus that was coming out of China. And, no one really knew, but I got there just in time. And then the world shut down after that. But I was able to go there, walk the grounds, this game refuge. And I uncovered a few shirt-tail cousins out there that I never knew existed, and that are also related to him. But yeah, it's in eastern Connecticut near Hartford.
Thank you.
Beautiful place. Yes?
I'm surprised that he got back into politics after such a long period and after having not been successful with a lot of opposition. What prompted him to be nominated for the Senate by the Republican Party? Was it because he was a well-known former governor and it was good for them to have someone like that on their ticket, or more than that?
Well, he was always very popular with the people. I think his opposition came from the powers that be that didn't like his reform element. He tried a comeback in 1905 that was unsuccessful for the Senate. And then he spent 2 years virtually campaigning for the 1911 campaign. Now, a little bit of trivia, maybe this is too much, but prior to 1913, senators were elected by state legislatures. I don't know if you knew that. And so he was able to get up enough support, but it was a close victory. But then after that, the last 2 times he ran for Senate were by popular vote. And he was very popular with the common people of Connecticut. The races were always close. He did broaden the base of the Republican Party by appealing to veterans, immigrants. He had a very good record on immigration. Many Republicans welcomed the hundreds of thousands of immigrants that were coming into the United States after the Civil War until the World War I. And he was very pro-immigration, partly because there was such a great need for new labor. But he had a very good record on that. He also was reached out to working people, unlike many of the other older generation of Republicans that were anti-labor. He did develop a coalition to bring that group into the fold. But these were very close elections, I will say. But I think his strength with many common people was the edge. Yeah. Yes?
Would you talk a little bit more about the writing process that you went through and the research? You mentioned going to the preserve and talking to distant cousins.
Well, first of all,
there must have been several documents, but were there any journals and private writing?
There were over 300 sources that went into this book, and some of the more valuable ones that I could fold into the narrative once I put the context of the narrative together were family writings. My grandfather was in many ways a surrogate son to George P. McLean. He had no children of his own, but he had 2 older sisters, and one of his older sisters was widowed when she had 3 children under the age of 8, and one of those children was my grandfather. And so he was like a surrogate father to my grandfather, and he wrote extensively about him, and many of the other nieces and nephews did as well, because he welcomed them. He was very, since he didn't have children of his own, I think he liked having these nephews and nieces around, but they were also very dependent upon him. So those writings were used. I also tried to assemble as many letters of his that were in other archives, other libraries. Of these other 300 sources, many books, many journal articles that mentioned him, journal articles about ornithology, about American history. Newspaper accounts, though, were probably the real bread and butter of the book. Over 55 newspapers were utilized because they helped document his career. This was the golden age of newspaper writing during this time. And so those newspaper accounts were very valuable in reconstructing his life and then interviews he gave, speeches he made. But these family writings were invaluable in terms of giving many insights about him. I can't resist but to mention about these 2 sisters that I mentioned. They were they led very unconventional lives. and they were older. One of them was widowed with 3 children, and she was somewhat of a free spirit, married late in life into a much older man who died. And so then he was kind of left with helping raise them, put them through college. My grandfather went through college, I'm sure, because of this man. But his other sister married and went out to California, and she married a silver mining speculator, a gambler, and she had twins who tragically died in California, and she came back to Connecticut, and he supported her. And I don't engage in much speculation, but I believe that these rather unconventional lives that they led him to be more conservative about some of his stances on issues. And because he was not, even though I mentioned he was for women's suffrage at the local and municipal level, I don't whitewash this man, okay? He was against national women's suffrage. And I struggle to understand that in the book. But one of the things I believe is that he saw what happened when people lived unconventional lives. And he felt that stability of society was so important. This is the year before the safety net, and I'm not trying to excuse his position, but I think that helped explain why he had this very traditional view about roles between the sexes. And then also, this was voted on, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, during World War I. And I think he felt that issues of war and peace should only be settled by those who were combatants. And it's very hard to understand how people felt, but what I try to do in the book is to say, why did he feel the way he did? Not to excuse him, not to say it was right or wrong, but an author's primary responsibility is to seek to understand their subject and not to condemn them or to excessively praise them. So I think one of the values of what I learned was, why did it take so long for women's suffrage to happen? And I think it's some certain attitudes that he had, but I could get more on the women's suffrage, but it's in the book, and I think it's instructive. No way do I sympathize with it, but I think it's instructive in terms of struggles that we went through as a nation. Yes.
Do you think you'll write another book someday?
This book was so consuming, and it really was a passion project in the sense that, honestly, it didn't start out as a book. We had a family reunion, and it was a 3-day family reunion. And I like small talk a little bit, but not 3 days worth of small talk. So I decided that I was going to prepare a PowerPoint presentation about George P. McLean for those of us who are more inclined to want to, study some things and get a break from the socializing. Well, it turned out to be a 4-hour PowerPoint presentation, 2 hours one day, 2 hours the next day. And one of my cousins said, you should write a book. And I don't know if she said that because she was afraid there might be a part 3. I don't know. But I had never really thought about it until then, because I was in working for corporations, everything boiled down to a PowerPoint, I mean, I love to write, but my goal was to try to make this accessible through a PowerPoint. But I uncovered so much interesting material, especially relating to the presidents that he knew. As a young person, I set a goal. I was going to read a biography of every president. And I think I'm pretty close. I've always been fascinated by our presidents. I think they're a window in time in terms of understanding our history and who they are. And so documenting his relationship with the 7 presidents he knew, 4 that he knew very well. He hunted and fished with 4. It was fascinating to get anecdotes about these presidents. Yes. And I think that there was not much knowledge about this individual. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. He was a Republican, okay? And my father was a FDR Democrat, and God love him. And I think when the stance that he took on the League of Nations, now I don't know if many of you remember your history but he was against the League of Nations. And for my grandfather, that was a unforgivable sin. And I think they began to be a little bit ashamed of this man, that he was this conservative Republican, although he was a Theodore Roosevelt type Republican. And if you know your history, they were the ones that were leading reform. Now, that's a very different Republican Party of that era than what we have today. So I think what I learned was that because of this being a Republican, especially the League of Nations stand and the women's suffrage, he was relegated to a position of almost, I won't say shame, but definitely not somebody that you really wanted to uphold and say, what did he do? And I think I've tried to be balanced and even-handed about him. We can't write off people because of our prejudices. And I feel in my own family, they kind of said, this guy was a Republican, he was against the League of Nations, and he was against women's suffrage. Let's kind of put him in the closet there and lock the door. And what I've discovered is that he had many great traits. He had some bad ones, but don't we all? And I think his stance on these issues is the same thing. The many things I admire, many things I don't. But he was a person, and he really, this idea about coming back in the Senate and not just living a life of retirement. Remember the Jay Gatsby era? He could have been Jay Gatsby if he wanted. But instead, he had this heart for service, and I think many people of that era did. And I believe he was also motivated by this idea of federal protection for birds that he could only do in the U.S. Senate. And that's why I think he came back and did that. So yes, there was a personal element to it, but I try to keep that in a minimum in the book. It's not, that's 5% of the book. Most of it is about him as a person, with a little bit about where I think, with things I learned about his role in my family that I never knew before. Yeah.